Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ALS United Mid Atlantic Goals Podcast. I'm Tony Heil, and if you've listened to this podcast over the last year, you've heard from a variety of different perspectives when it comes to ALS. We've talked with people who are living with ALS, caregivers, other family members who've been impacted by ALS, volunteers, board members, staff, and even people from other organizations that have worked on ALS and other diseases that impact our mission, including people from Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, because when we're united, we can fund more research, we can fund science, and we can come together to support those who are getting us closer to cures for ALS and other diseases, because we have so much in common sometimes with the research community. Today, I'm really excited to talk with my friend Jean Swidler. She is with End the Legacy, and they're working on a lot of that science and education when it comes to genetic ALS. She's going to talk about how that work can help everyone with ALS because it really translates to research that can help everyone who's curious about ALS or could be connected to the disease. And by partnering together and learning from each other, we can get closer to those new treatments and cures. So, Jean, thank you so much for talking today about your work at End the Legacy.
Thank you so much, Tony, for having me, and really happy to chat.
So, Jean, tell me about what End the Legacy is, and then we'll talk about your background.
Sure. So we are a community group of those impacted by genetic or inherited ALS and FTD. We say NFTD as many of the genes responsible for these inherited diseases, although there are also genes that just cause one or the other. So we work on providing community support, education, for our community members, as well as being a voice for the community as advocates and promoting research about our community.
Thank you very much. And I think that that's a community that's always growing. It's never the same community year after year. So I'm sure that you are often learning from the community of people who have a genetic connection to ALS.
Yeah, no, it's always growing because it's inherited. So people are reproducing and more people are being born into these families, as well as more people finding out that they might have a link through further gene discoveries or through their family getting tested. Although in many families, such as mine, people know about it just because of the disease across generations.
So that's a good opening. Tell me about your connection and what brought you to End the Legacy.
So my first experience of ALS was when I was a small child. Mom lived down the street. We lived down the street from my grandparents, my mom's parents. And when I was about 6, my grandmother was diagnosed with ALS. This is around 1989, 1990. This was old housing stock in the inner suburbs of New York City in Westchester. And my grandfather renovated their home majorly to make it more easy for my grandmother to live there, including putting an elevator in his 100-year-old wood house in 1990, which was quite a scene. My grandmother ended up living only a very short time after diagnosis. Seeing all those home modifications were very much not put to much use. My mother, after that, who is the oldest of 7 children, they had 8 in the family. One died when they were a child. Of 7 adult children, my mom was the oldest. And she was very anxious about developing ALS. So I would hear about that all the time growing up. Her siblings didn't really talk about it, but my mom did. And she wouldn't really talk about details, just she was worried about ALS. Or maybe she had it or this sort of thing. Finally, when she was in her later 60s, in 2016, my mother started having complaints of issues walking. She ended up going to a neurologist at work, and this was in Westchester, right outside New York City. And my mother shared about how her mother and her grandfather, which I hadn't really understood, had died of ALS, and that she knew that this is what it looked like. And the neurologist did not that story, did not order genetic testing, just did EMGs on her feet and said she had nerve damage, but called it peripheral neuropathy unexplained and sent her on her way with physical therapy. So, what did I think? What did my dad think? What did all of the people in my mother's life think? Well, look, you were so worried about this ALS thing, but the doctor says you don't have it. So this is a really good thing. You're not dying. Wonderful. But of course, that's not how my mom felt. She felt very alone. And, she knew she was dying of ALS. He wasn't even given permission to feel that way because the doctor had said she didn't have it. So she went to physical therapy and tried, and she gained some new muscles in her legs, but she continued to become paralyzed. And over the next 10 months, her hand stopped working properly and she started getting bulbar symptoms. And then in the summer 2017, she fell and broke her hip, and the hip surgeon gave her because she was supposed to be off the walker after the surgery after a certain amount of time, and she could not because she was becoming paralyzed. The hip surgeon accused her of not doing her exercise. It's not pleasant. And then finally, 10 months after her first neurological visit, she was referred back to a neurologist and diagnosed with ALS. And then they sent her to Columbia, New York City, where my grandmother, I believe, had been seen, but for some reason my mother didn't get there until after this neurological visit. And she was diagnosed again with ALS, and they did genetic testing and found the C9 repeat expansion. And I also heard about siblings of my grandmother who may have had dementia, which I had never heard about before. And I understood more about my grandfather, or great grandfather, her grandfather had died of ALS. I was able to take some time off from work with FMLA to help care for my mom. My parents had a big old wooden house with lots of stairs, and they considered modifying the house or putting beds on the first floor or something. But I guess seeing what my grandmother and grandfather had put up with, my mom and my dad moved to a new wheelchair friendly apartment very quickly while they proceeded to try to sell their house. That was interesting to see the difference there from totally renovating the house, installing an elevator, to just moving out very quickly and going to a wheelchair accessible place. A funny note about that also is my grandfather lived to be in his 90s. And so he only died in 2015. And when they liquidated his estate, my mom made sure to grab the wheelchair ramp that he had held on to since 1990 for my grandmother. And she had my brother take it down the block to our house because she was so convinced she was going to get ALS that she wanted to have the wheelchair ramp available.
Wow.
That just, shows sort of the mindset that she was in. And despite that mindset, that she had this really hard time getting diagnosed. And she progressed very rapidly after her diagnosis. She got diagnosed in October, and then she never walked again after April of the following year. And she passed away in February. That time, her youngest sister was clearly having trouble walking in her later phase. And after my mom's funeral, and I was back home for a little bit with my dad, staying with my dad for a little bit. And I went to Columbia for their at-risk research. I knew that my mom appreciated things like that. She donated her brain. So I signed up for that. When my mom was sick, I did not want to talk about the inheritance or dwell on it because I did not want to mother to have her think about the downstream effects of all of that. But after she passed away, I felt to do that. So I did. And then I told my family about the C9 in an email that I wrote with the genetic counselor at Columbia. And um, I proceeded to talk to my aunt a lot about all of this, who clearly had symptoms. She took her time getting diagnosed. I would talk about it around the bush with her, but she basically didn't see the point. Maybe 10 months after that, agreed to go to the research study for at-risk relatives, Columbia. But she was diagnosed when she walked in because she clearly had ALS. She lived for a few years. My uncle took very good care of her, and she was a little younger than my mom, so her disease course was a little bit slower. And she lived for 3 or 4 years after diagnosis. Got to meet her first grandchild, which is lovely. and she died at 63. My mom died at 70. A year after my aunt died, my uncle was diagnosed with ALS. He was more of the middle child of those seven, and he had a very rapid disease course. And he again shared that he delayed getting diagnosed. That his doctor brought it up in January, but he said, "Oh, do all your exclusions." So he didn't get diagnosed until April, May, or something, and then he lived for just a short time, maybe 6 months after diagnosis. So in for 26 years, 27 years, there was no ALS diagnosis in my immediate family, from my grandmother to my mom. Then in 6 years, there was three deaths in the next generation. So you can kind of see how generationally these things can pan out.
Yeah, I know a family here with the SOD1 gene that it was a similar story where the father had ALS in the 80s, and then three out of six siblings developed and passed away from ALS within 5 years. And they had done the walks with us for years for their father, who had passed away in the 80s, never really thinking there was more to it. And his widow, who's just such a lovely woman, I don't think she ever expected to have ALS in her family again, and then within just a few years, person after person. So I'm so sorry for your family, and I really appreciate all that you've done, which you'll talk about, but I just appreciate that you've continued that fight because it's not easy.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. My family definitely knew that there was inheritance given the two generations and I don't know about the parents of my great grandfather, but maybe they did know something. Apparently, Columbia reached out to my grandfather when SOD1 was discovered in the early mid 90s, which was after my grandmother died. And he told my mother and her siblings about it, and he advised them to not look into it. So that was an interesting thing that I heard from them.
I can see that. Now, one thing you mentioned that struck out to me about your mom, it reminds me of my friend Gary. His wife, Paula, passed away from ALS, and it took over a year to be diagnosed, but she had ALS in her family as well. Her father had passed away from ALS. During her symptoms, she felt herself that she had ALS, and she did, but doctors did not trust her. And this was over 12, 13 years ago. 14, over 14 years ago now. And what I learned from Paula, and from Gary is that there is such a lack of trust of listening to women in healthcare, and that she knew her symptoms, but her doctor, who is not a doctor that's affiliated with us, but didn't believe that she had it. Do you think that understanding genetic diseases like ALS and FTD can help with some of that discrimination that can happen in healthcare?
Well, really, there was a failure of the field and the, incumbent advocacy world in ALS to highlight that were these people at risk and
Hmm.
that they needed a different understanding of how ALS would be diagnosed for those people. And this is not just anecdotes. MGH, it's Dr. Paganoni had a paper from around 2014, many diagnostic delay in ALS, and they showed that familial patients had a 9-month delay from symptom onset to diagnosis, which was a little shorter than sporadic patients. When you consider that in the case of my mother, the tenor of not being diagnosed when you know that you have it and you have reason to suspect you have it, very different than when ALS is the blue. So there was every reason to consider that a different case for decades, really. For whenever there became an understanding that ALS should be diagnosed, which after the introduction of Riluzole in the 90s and supportive care techniques that really exploded in the 90s and early 2000s, there was really a consensus among the field studying ALS that people should be diagnosed promptly. And yet, to support the genetic community and making that happen just was not on the table at all. Nobody would really think about it. And in the general management of ALS, somebody walking into a doctor's office talking about ALS is considered like Munchausen syndrome or something, like malingering. Like people have heard some terrible disease and they think they have it and they're just looking for attention. So I think that's really what our family members have encountered. when discussing this, because even if they're more less academic, less major center doctors might not be as up on the research, even if they went looking, genetic ALS, you know, uh, somebody at risk, how should I handle them? There would have been nothing that they would have found. So, of course, without any of that, they would treat them the same as they would treat any random person walking in saying that they had this rare disease. A lot of criticism. So that was something really hard to understand. I remember the first meeting that I went to, there was some big discussion on diagnosing ALS. And I was like, what about the at-risk people? What about just checking in with them? They could be diagnosed earlier. My background is as of a labor union organizer. I worked with health workers for many years. We've talked about this, Tony, that you
Yeah,
also.
we both worked at the same place,
Yeah.
which is crazy.
But not together, but the same organizations. And I could tell that it was so strange that our community of people impacted did not have a voice. There was no reflection of living in this state anywhere. The only discussions on the ALS Association's website, for example, would just say how rare inheritance was
Hmm.
rather than any contemplation of what being impacted by inheritance was like. So that seemed strange to me. And then when Daniel Barvin posted a thread on a Facebook group for people impacted that said, "Hey, I've seen this group for Huntington's disease that's focused on the at-risk community. Why don't we?" I was very prepared to say, "Oh, that was around 2020. First, we really thought that we were going to be working on resources, education, and story sharing. It soon became clear that there were these issues about and about our community's voice, and
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that because I didn't hear you for whatever you just said?
that when we first got together in 2020 after Daniel Barvin made a call for people to come together, we really thought that just providing a space of support, providing stories, that sort of thing would be what our community needed. As we began looking more into the field, the academic field studying us, there was a clear lack of community having a, and that we very much needed to make sure our community's interests were were recognized when the disease was being, and that hadn't been happening for the prior decades. That became a big concern for us.
So tell me what End the Legacy does then that makes it unique or an important voice in the ALS community when it comes to these issues.
Well, previously there was quite a pickle in that the field was studying us, studying the people at genetic. There would be nobody impacted at risk by genetics table to talk about these issues. So our community was totally absent from any contemplation of what was happening to us. So issues that were kind of esoteric, sporadic ailments, but of dire importance to us, like diagnostic standards, we would just not be discussed. For example, is a new diagnostic criteria for AIDS created around 2020 called the Gold Coast criteria, which lowered the bar for diagnosis for patients, but it actually raised the diagnostic bar for people genetic risk of ALS. And I talked to some of the people involved, and hey, there must have been some big debate about you raise the diagnostic bar for the people at genetic risk. I assume you had good reasons. And they were like, oh, we didn't talk about it. And I saw that the people from the ALS Association, people from the M&D Association were on the committee that drafted it. So these organizations just did not see our community as who they were speaking for. We really needed to make sure we were there to speak for ourselves.
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense in that you can be very well meaning, like I can be very well meaning, but if I do not include the person who with that lived experience in those decision making, then I may not have the mindset to think about their issues in the same way. Just like the phrase "nothing about us without us" in the disability community.
Yeah, and that's a good point. But I will say that the interests of people manifested by manifesting kind of pretty clear, and it is important to have people with lived experience involved. It wasn't just a question of people with lived experience in the room. It was a question anyone in the room with a hat on that said, "I'm here for the people impacted by genetic ALS." So nobody was fighting for this community. The researchers were advocating for talking about it because it's interesting and there are things about it, but nobody was looking at the actual community. It's a little more nuanced.
And so you talk about not just earlier diagnosis, but if you know about family history through genetics, like yours, other people I know that have been on this podcast in general, not only can you get earlier diagnosis, but you talked about the housing changes your family did. You can maybe make better decisions about what kind of home modifications you do for regular life because you have that in your mindset, right? You can do better planning for yourself by understanding family history and having that community behind you.
Guess, but I would from, orientating your life for all of the genes implicated, the penetrance or the disease are not very clearly understood. And the average age of onset is wide, so you can't really accurately predict when people are disease. Certainly appears for C9 or 72. The most family history can give a guide to the risk of disease. Even in a case with lots of cases, when somebody would get it is not really clear. They don't know that it's great adaptive attitude to think all the time of to plan your life like you're going to get it, in the sense of nobody's guaranteed, really.
Right, that makes sense. And I think that's a really good perspective in general because you could worry at age 30 about ALS in your family, and that could be 40 years down the road, and you could have missed out on a whole life. And so, having a community like you're creating and fostering helps people to feel comfortable about living their life as well.
So that's something we hope, and your family members may not get it. In other people around who are okay talking about it. And that's why we really also appreciate the concept of
The
that
concept of what? Say
folks
that again.
at-risk care. People can receive care for their risk or they are sick. The general attitude prior to the establishment we helped was that people at risk should go to the doctor. Genetic ALS to be healthy. I don't know that we should be deputized to decide when we have symptoms. So having some kind of regular monitoring in place allows us to offload that worry or that monitoring for symptoms from ourselves to somebody else. And I think that there's power in anxiety reduction there. And I just
Yeah,
wanted
go ahead.
to share one thing I do have to go at the top of the hour. For everyone impacted by ALS, we don't know when any therapeutic approach might work best or work at all based on when in the disease it's administered. So we really feel that it's an urgency for all ALS patients that we start trialing drugs earlier in the disease process. And really, the only group of people that's practical in is people at genetic risk, because we're the only people you can track when we're close to symptom onset to try a drug a little bit earlier. And so we really feel that that's an important thing that we need to push.
Well, I appreciate that you're doing that. Before we finish here today, what do you want people to know if people are interested in genetic ALS, whether they have it in their family, maybe they have a friend or loved one impacted by ALS in their family? What would you like them to know about End the Legacy to educate them?
For anyone impacted by genetic ALS or FTD, we are always recruiting. So we are a community group. We invite people to come and be involved. It can be very powerful to go into our team meetings and see 20, 25 people impacted and to hear that everyone else is impacted too. For folks who can't make meetings, we do have an email list. So just email us at info@endthelegacy.org if you'd like to get involved. You can visit our website at endthelegacy.org. And for folks who are not sure if they're impacted by genetic, discussing that with your doctor is probably a very good thing.
Right, because you're not going to tell them, here's the medications you should take. Like, that's a doctor decision. But what we can do here at ALS United Mid Atlantic and our other ALS United partners is if we know someone with a family history with ALS, and we could direct them to talk with you as a further resource and we can have that back and forth where if you know someone that is in our area that needs a wheelchair, like that's how well we can focus on that united word so we can collaborate and help our families together.
And I will say that if people are at risk and they want to know what to do, there is actually some formal guidance out now. It's available on our website at endthelegacy.org. That actually has a paper that recently came out that details steps people can take, which none of them are too wild, but we're starting to more formalize that. And there will be a follow-up meeting later this spring to further refine that advice.
Great. Well, we'll put the link in our description here. So when this is on our different platforms, people can go and learn more about End the Legacy if they have any questions. And they can email info at End the Legacy with their questions as well or be involved in the community. I have known many families, whether it's C9 or like our friend Gently, who was on our podcast recently, and I was so glad to meet her in person at our Help and Hope event. And maybe, Gene, next year we can have you come visit as well. And I know people with the SOD1 gene mutation in their family. They're very dedicated advocates, not just for themselves, but for anyone impacted by this disease. If you want to learn more about our work, alsmidatlantic.org. And we'll put the link for End the Legacy here as well. Gene, thank you for what you're doing. I'm really glad that we can connect to support the wider ALS community and make sure that those impacted by familial ALS have a voice at the table.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, and thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you so much again. If you're interested, please join us, and together we can end ALS.